What do you call a woman who murdered her own newborn daughter, fed prisoners to wild animals, and made grown men wet themselves at the mention of her name? You call her Empress Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in Chinese history, and arguably the most psychotic ruler the world has ever seen. While most people think of brutal ancient rulers, they picture men like Caligula or Nero, but Wu Zetian made these guys look like choir boys. From 690 to 705 AD, this woman turned the Tang dynasty into her personal torture playground. She created execution methods so creative that they became legends of horror. She built a secret police network that would make the KGB jealous. And yes, she literally kept wild animals specifically to devour her prisoners alive. But here's the twisted part. She was also one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into the blood-soaked story of how a concubine became China's most terrifying emperor. The bloody rise, Wu Zetian's path to power started in the most mundane way possible, as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong. But this woman had ambitions that would make Macbeth look like an underachiever, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like imperial hierarchy stop her. When Taizong died in 649 AD, Wu should have been shipped off to a Buddhist nunnery like all the other concubines. Instead, she seduced the dead emperor's son, Gaozong, who was now the new emperor. The problem? Gaozong already had an empress, Empress Wang, and a favorite concubine named Consort Xiao. Wu's solution was elegantly horrific. She got pregnant and gave birth to a daughter. Then, in a move that would shock even seasoned palace conspirators, she strangled her own newborn baby and framed Empress Wang for the murder. When Gaozong found the tiny corpse, Wu played the grieving mother so convincingly that he immediately suspected his wife. But Wu wasn't done. She systematically poisoned Gaozong's mind against both Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, feeding him lies and manufactured evidence. When both women were finally arrested, Wu personally oversaw their punishment. She had their hands and feet cut off, then threw them into wine vats to drown slowly in their own blood. As they died, Consort Xiao allegedly cursed Wu, saying she would return as a cat to haunt her forever. Wu was so spooked by this curse that she banned all cats from the imperial palace for the rest of her life. Apparently even psychopaths have their phobias. By 655 AD, Wu had eliminated her competition and become empress herself. But this was just the warm-up act. The real horror show was about to begin. The torture chambers of innovation. Once Wu Zetian consolidated power, she turned torture into an art form. The woman didn't just execute people, she studied their suffering like a twisted scientist, constantly inventing new ways to maximize agony before death. Her most infamous creation was called human swine. First, Wu would have the victims' limbs amputated, then their eyes were gouged out and their ears cut off. The tongue was removed, and finally they were thrown into a pigsty to wallow in filth until they died from infection or starvation. She used this technique on her old rivals, Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, after they were already defeated and imprisoned. But Wu wanted them to suffer, not just die. She personally visited them in their cells, taunting them as they begged for mercy, before ordering the human swine treatment. Then there was her bronze cauldron method. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into massive bronze vessels filled with water. Fires were lit underneath, slowly bringing the water to a boil. Wu would often watch these executions while eating her meals, treating the screams like dinner entertainment. But perhaps most disturbing was her reverse hanging technique. Victims were suspended upside down with their feet tied to the ceiling. This position causes blood to rush to the head, creating intense pressure and eventual brain hemorrhaging. Death could take hours, and Wu reportedly timed different variations to see which lasted longest. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Wu kept detailed records of these torture sessions. She treated human suffering like a recipe book, noting which methods worked best on different types of people. Old men died faster from the bronze cauldron. Young women lasted longer with reverse hanging. Children? Well, let's just say she had special methods for them too. Her torture chambers became legendary throughout the empire. The mere threat of being sent to Wu's laboratories was enough to make hardened generals confess to crimes they didn't commit. The secret police state. Wu Zetian didn't just rule through fear, she systematized it. She created the most sophisticated surveillance network in ancient history, turning the entire Tang Empire into a paranoid nightmare where nobody could trust anyone. Her secret police were called the cruel officials, and these weren't your typical palace guards. Wu handpicked psychopaths and sadists, then gave them unlimited power to investigate, arrest, and torture anyone they suspected of disloyalty. The most notorious was Li Junqian, a man so twisted that even Wu's other officials feared him. Li developed something called the 10 tortures. These included crushing fingers with metal pincers, driving bamboo splinters under fingernails, and a particularly nasty technique where victims were forced to swallow scalding vinegar until their throats dissolved. But his masterpiece was the donkey colt kicking backwards. Prisoners were tied in impossible positions that slowly dislocated every joint in their body. Wu's network operated on a simple principle. Anyone could accuse anyone of anything, anonymously. She installed bronze boxes throughout the capital where people could drop written accusations. No evidence was required. A single anonymous note could result in arrest, torture, and execution. The system created a culture of absolute terror. Husbands informed on wives. Children betrayed parents. Servants sold out their masters for the promise of reward or simply to avoid suspicion themselves. Wu encouraged this betrayal by offering promotions and gold to successful informants. But here's the genius part. Wu also spied on her own spies. She created multiple competing intelligence networks that watched each other, ensuring that even her cruel officials lived in constant fear. Li Junqian himself was eventually executed when Wu decided he was becoming too powerful. The psychological impact was devastating. Court officials would arrive at work each morning not knowing if they'd return home that evening. Some nobles became so paranoid they refused to speak above whispers, even in their own homes. Others developed nervous tics, constantly looking over their shoulders or jumping at unexpected sounds. Wu's secret police didn't just gather information, they manufactured it. When Wu wanted someone eliminated, her agents would plant evidence, forge documents, or torture false confessions out of random prisoners. The truth became whatever Wu needed it to be. Wild animals as executioners. Here's where Wu Zetian earned her reputation as history's most creative killer. While other emperors collected exotic animals for prestige, Wu collected them for murder. Her palace wasn't just home to the imperial court, it was home to a carefully curated zoo of human-eating beasts. Wu's menagerie read like a nightmare bestiary. Starved tigers paced in reinforced cages, their ribs showing through matted fur. Packs of feral dogs, bred specifically for aggression, snarled behind iron bars. Bears, deliberately provoked and underfed, clawed at their enclosures. And then there were the wolves, Wu's personal favorites, trained to hunt humans like deer. The execution process was pure theater. Prisoners were dragged naked into circular stone arenas while Wu and her guests watched from elevated platforms, sipping wine and nibbling delicacies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Refined aristocrats dining on roasted duck while humans became the main course below. Each animal served a specific purpose in Wu's twisted justice system. Tigers were reserved for high-ranking traitors because she believed their royal nature matched the crime. Wolves got corrupt officials, pack hunters for pack conspirators, as Wu put it. The wild dogs were saved for family members who betrayed her because dogs were supposed to be loyal. But Wu's most diabolical innovation was her progressive feeding method. Instead of letting the animals kill quickly, she trained them to toy with their prey first. Bears were taught to swipe at victims without delivering fatal blows immediately. Tigers learned to pin prisoners down and lick their wounds, prolonging the agony. The dogs were the worst. They'd often eat their victims starting from the feet, keeping them conscious for as long as possible. Wu kept meticulous records of these executions like a demented scientist. She documented which animals provided the most educational deaths, which ones terrified audiences most effectively, and which techniques caused the longest suffering. Some of her notes survive today, written in her own hand, describing human death throes with the same clinical detachment as a cooking recipe. The psychological impact extended far beyond the actual victims. Wu would sometimes march condemned prisoners past the animal cages before their trials, letting them hear the hungry growls and see the blood-stained floors. Many confessed to imaginary crimes just to avoid the beasts, choosing execution by sword instead. Her dinner parties became legendary for their horror. Foreign ambassadors would arrive expecting typical imperial entertainment and instead witness humans being devoured alive between courses. Some visitors reportedly vomited or fainted, which only amused Wu more. She saw their revulsion as proof of her power. She could make grown men sick just by showing them what happened to her enemies. Paranoia unleashed. By the 690s, Wu Zetian's paranoia had reached pathological levels. She saw conspiracies everywhere, enemies in every shadow, and traitors behind every smile. Her response wasn't just to eliminate threats, it was to eliminate entire bloodlines, friend networks, and anyone who might theoretically pose a problem someday. The numbers are staggering. Historical records suggest Wu ordered the execution of over 100,000 people during her reign. But these weren't random killings. They were systematic purges designed to reshape Chinese society according to her twisted vision. Her most ruthless campaign targeted the old aristocratic families who had opposed her rise to power. Wu didn't just kill the family heads, she exterminated entire lineages. Men, women, children, elderly grandparents, distant cousins, servants, and even family pets were slaughtered to ensure no one could seek revenge later. She called this root and branch elimination, cutting down the tree and burning the stump. The Tang imperial family suffered worst of all. Wu systematically murdered her own stepsons, nephews, and in-laws. She forced one of her own sons to commit suicide, then attended his funeral with crocodile tears. Another son was exiled and later murdered by Wu's agents. She eliminated potential heirs with the same cold efficiency she used on strangers. But Wu's paranoia extended beyond obvious political threats. She became convinced that scholars and intellectuals were plotting against her through secret codes hidden in their writings. Hundreds of poets, historians, and philosophers were arrested on charges of literary treason. Their crime? Using metaphors that Wu's paranoid mind interpreted as veiled criticism. The bronze accusation boxes became instruments of mass murder. Anonymous denunciations flooded in daily, and Wu's cruel officials followed up on every single one. A servant could destroy their master with a few scribbled lies. A jealous neighbor could eliminate a rival with false accusations. The system turned the entire empire into a nation of informants and victims. Wu even purged her own government repeatedly. Ministers who served her faithfully for years would suddenly find themselves accused of treason based on dreams Wu claimed to have. She executed 3 different sets of advisors during her reign, replacing them with increasingly terrified yes-men who agreed with everything she said. The psychological toll was immense. Court sessions became Russian roulette. No one knew who would be dragged away in chains. Some officials wrote final letters to their families every morning before going to work, assuming each day might be their last. Others developed nervous breakdowns, twitching uncontrollably whenever Wu looked in their direction. By the end of her reign, Wu had created an empire of ghosts. Entire noble families had vanished. Ancient bloodlines were extinct. The Tang court, once filled with brilliant minds and cultural luminaries, became a wasteland of terrified survivors who spoke only in whispers and agreed with everything the Empress said. The Empress's final madness. As Wu Zetian aged, her grip on reality loosened, and her paranoia transformed into something even more disturbing. Complete delusion mixed with supernatural obsession. The woman who had once calculated every murder now believed she was a living goddess destined to rule forever. Wu became convinced that she was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. She commissioned massive statues of herself as a deity, demanding that subjects worship her image. Temple ceremonies were rewritten to include prayers to Empress Buddha Wu. Anyone who questioned her divinity was immediately executed for blasphemy. Her palace became a bizarre shrine to her own immortality. Wu surrounded herself with fortune-tellers, alchemists, and mystics who fed her increasingly ridiculous prophecies about her eternal reign. She consumed mercury-based immortality pills that slowly poisoned her brain, making her delusions worse. Her skin turned grayish, her hair fell out in clumps, but she insisted these were signs of her divine transformation. The most disturbing development was her obsession with young male lovers. Wu, now in her 70s, kept a rotating collection of handsome young men who were essentially sexual slaves. But here's the twisted part. She would execute them after a few months to preserve their beauty in death. She believed that killing them at their peak would somehow transfer their youth to her. Her decision-making became completely erratic. She would order the execution of entire villages based on dreams, then forget about it the next day. She declared war on neighboring kingdoms, then immediately sued for peace when she couldn't remember why they were fighting. Her own ministers started ignoring her commands, hoping she'd forget what she had ordered. Wu's final years were marked by increasingly bizarre rituals. She would hold conversations with empty chairs, claiming to speak with the spirits of her victims. She ordered the construction of a massive underground tomb where she planned to rule over the dead, complete with miniature palaces and an army of ceramic servants. The mercury poisoning eventually caught up with her. Wu began having seizures, violent mood swings, and periods where she couldn't recognize her own reflection. She would scream at mirrors, believing they showed her enemies instead of herself. Her courtiers watched in horrified fascination as the most powerful woman in Chinese history slowly lost her mind. The end came in 705 AD, when Wu's own ministers finally found the courage to revolt. She was too weak and confused to resist effectively. The woman who had terrorized an empire for decades was quietly removed from power and died shortly after, probably from mercury poisoning. Even her death was ironic. killed by the very immortality treatments she thought would make her a goddess forever. Wu Zetian, the woman who redefined what it meant to be ruthless. She murdered her own baby, fed prisoners to wild animals, and turned an entire empire into her personal torture chamber. Yet somehow, she was also one of China's most effective rulers, expanding the empire and promoting talented people regardless of their social class. Wu's legacy is complicated in the most disturbing way possible. She proved that women could be just as brutal as men when given absolute power. Maybe even more so. Her reign lasted 15 years, longer than many male emperors who are remembered as great leaders. But while they're celebrated in history books, Wu is often portrayed as a cautionary tale about what happens when power corrupts completely. If this glimpse into history's darkest corners fascinated you, there are plenty more twisted rulers waiting to be uncovered. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which historical psychopath you want to hear about next. Trust me, Wu Zetian has plenty of competition for the title of history's most brutal leader.